Tim Scott, the Republican senator and presidential candidate, publicly and despicably declared President Biden to be complicit in this weekend's terrorist attacks against Israel by Hamas. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Maybe check out my Patreon. I'd appreciate the support. All right, folks, so let's talk about Tim Scott, because Lord knows nobody else is with respect to the Republican primary campaign. He's a Republican senator from South Carolina, and he presents himself as this kind of affable, super Christian, civility politics-based politician. And yet, for whatever reason, I don't know if his advisors told him to do it, or he just woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning, or if he was more Old Testament than New Testament, went more wrathful, Tim Scott decided to baselessly just smear President Biden and just hit him hard out of nowhere and blame him for this past weekend's attacks against Israel by the terrorist group Hamas. He says Biden's weakness invited the attack. Biden's negotiation funded the attack. The Biden administration wanted Israel to stand down after the attack. At this point, Biden is complicit. Super gross, okay? So everything he said here was absolutely absurd. He's, of course, referring to the attacks which began on Saturday, in which the terrorist organization Hamas launched thousands of rockets into Israeli cities and then raided those cities and killed soldiers and civilians and kidnapped people. It's like 700 at the time of this recording. I believe it's 700 Israelis confirmed dead, 500 or 600 Palestinians confirmed dead, and at least 9 Americans confirmed dead. Now, we're going to do a separate video about the funding claim in particular, because this is something that's been going around quite a bit. Basically, it's the idea is that Iran may or may not have been involved in the planning of the attacks with Hamas, and they're blaming the recent negotiation, the prisoner exchange between President Biden and Iran, in which we released 5 of their prisoners. They gave us 5 Americans back. Tim Scott and many other Republicans are trying to claim, baselessly, that contributed, and the funds that were involved contributed to the Hamas attack. But again, that'll be for a separate video. Tim Scott says, basically, Biden's weak, that he invited the attack, that he didn't want Israel to fight back. He is complicit. This is what President Biden had to say publicly after the initial attacks occurred.
Today, the people of Israel are under attack, orchestrated by a terrorist organization, Hamas. In this moment of tragedy, I want to say to them and to the world and to terrorists everywhere that the United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back. We'll make sure that they have the help their citizens need and they can continue to defend themselves. You know, the world's seen appalling images. Thousands of rockets in the space of hours raining down on Israeli cities. When I got up this morning and started this at 7:30, 8 o'clock, my calls. Hamas terrorists crossing in Israel, killing not only Israeli soldiers, but Israeli civilians in the street, in their homes, innocent people murdered, wounded, entire families taken hostage by Hamas, just days after Israel marked the holiest of days in the Jewish calendar. It's unconscionable. You know, when I spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu this morning, I told him the United States stands with the people of Israel in the face of these terrorist assaults. Israel has the right to defend itself and its people, full stop. There's never justification for terrorist attacks. And my administration's support for Israel's security is rock solid and unwavering.
So he publicly says in the White House to the American people and to the rest of the world that Israel has a right to defend itself, full stop, and that the United States stands behind Israel. I'm not sure what exactly Tim Scott found confusing about that, but it certainly seems to be in a contrast to Biden's weakness invited the attack. There's no basis for that. There's no attribution to this idea that Hamas only attacked Israel. With Hamas, this Palestinian terrorist organization, and Israel have been in conflict for decades. Okay, this is nothing new. I don't understand how Biden played a role in it. That's just Tim Scott speculating wildly to try to tar his Democratic rival, so to speak, and the sitting president. Again, we'll address the funding part, but he also claims that Biden wanted Israel to stand down. There's no indication of that at all either. But the thing that really gets me about all this, and I mention it actually in an article that I wrote on Luke Beasley's website, because I'm also doing that in addition to these videos. I like writing. I've always been a geek for it, so you can find articles that I write that Luke is allowing me to put on his website. But I discussed this, how once upon a time, the expectation was, and this was from Republicans, by the way, Republicans used to say, they said it under President Reagan, they said it under President H.W. Bush, they said it under President W. Bush, I believe they've even said it under Donald Trump, this idea that listen, in times of crisis, domestic or foreign, you're supposed to unite behind the sitting president. I remember hearing it. I mean, I wasn't alive during the Reagan administration, and I was basically an infant during the last few months of the H.W. Bush administration. But I vividly recall being in middle school and elementary school during the Bush administration that the expectation, especially after 9/11, was you shouldn't criticize the sitting president. You're supposed to uncritically unite behind them, or at least be very, very tempered and careful in your criticism when there's a crisis, because that's just what you do. That's patriotism. You're supposed to unite behind the president. And yet it seems to me, be it Clinton, certainly President Obama, and now President Biden, Republicans don't heed their own advice. So then it occurred to me, maybe what they really meant this entire time is that the country is supposed to unite behind, and there's supposed to be bipartisan support for, sitting Republican presidents. Then you're supposed to be like, just, yeah, whatever you want, Mr. President. By God, we're patriots. We love America first. All these petty partisan political things, that's aside. We can do that later. They never match that energy or replicate that standard when it's a Democrat in office. It's one of the many, 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 the infinite, profound hypocrisies of the GOP. So when you see this, I mean, Tim Scott's been excoriated, and rightly so, and should continue to be for the foreseeable future, and as a matter of fact should be anytime he has an interview. Listen, I thought you were the member of the party which says that when there's a crisis, domestic or foreign, we're supposed to unite behind the president, be very careful when and where we criticize them. So why is it that you expect that when it's a Republican president, but you won't reciprocate that when it's a Democratic president? Tim Scott should be forced to answer these questions. He should also be forced to provide rock-solid evidence for his bold claims. But at the end of the day, what this proves is that the GOP, the modern GOP, and especially in terms of its leadership, they don't care about patriotism as we understand it. They want patriotism when it's convenient for them politically, and when it's inconvenient for them politically, then it's a free-for-all, right? And if it's a Democratic president, you can say whatever you want, whenever you want. You don't even, it's not even just criticism. You can just be straight up lies. You can just lie about a sitting Democratic president during a time of foreign or domestic crisis, and that's okay, apparently, because it's a Democratic president. Anyway, incredibly disgusting remarks from Tim Scott. He's rightly being excoriated, and if you have the opportunity, you should excoriate him too on Twitter.